The most notorious mafia boss in Chicago, Knox Ashford, stood in the falling snow with trembling hands. Hands that had once crushed lives without blinking were now unable to keep a roll of tape steady as he pressed missing person flyers onto a dark brick wall. For 24 days, his mother had been missing. The police had closed the case, and even his vast underground empire had come up empty. He was a man the whole city feared. Yet tonight, he was nothing more than a son wasting away. But when he stepped into a lonely diner to escape the storm, the young waitress behind the counter froze. She recognized the woman in the photograph, the same woman who had been singing lullabies in her apartment for 3 weeks. Knox thought his nightmare was over, but he was wrong. Finding his mother was only the beginning of a much darker mystery. As her memory slowly returned, it pointed toward a truth so chilling that it would threaten to shatter the very foundation of Knox's empire. Stay tuned, because the reunion is only the start of a war you never saw coming. If this story touched your heart, please leave a like to support the channel in creating more stories like this. Share the video with the people you love, because sometimes the right story at the right moment can remind us of what matters most. And if you haven't subscribed yet, tap subscribe now so you won't miss the next episodes. The clock on the diner wall read 12:23 in the morning when Bryn Holloway untied the red apron, stained with grease, stuffed it into her bag, and slipped out the back door. The January wind in Chicago slapped her face like a reminder that the world outside was never gentle with people like her. Bryn pulled her thin jacket tighter around herself, the one she had bought at a thrift store for $7. Its inner lining already rotted through 2 winters ago, but she didn't have the money to replace it. Her hands were cracked raw from cleaning chemicals, tiny fissures running along her knuckles like a map of a life that never got to rest. She walked fast along the frozen sidewalk, eyes straight ahead, not looking left where St. Catherine's Orphanage stood silent in the darkness. She never looked at that building, not because she'd forgotten, but because she remembered too well. 15 years earlier, she had stood behind those iron doors, 12 years old, watching her mother's back grow smaller at the end of the road before she stepped into a taxi without turning around. No letters, no explanation, just the lingering scent of cheap perfume in the air, and a child standing there until her legs went numb, still believing her mother would come back. She never did. Then came 3 foster families, 3 houses where none of them were home. The first locked Bryn in a closet for 3 days because she broke a plate. The second used her as unpaid help until neighbors called Child Protective Services. The third had a man with eyes she never wanted to remember. Bryn survived it all, not because she was strong, but because she had no choice but to wake up every morning. She passed the bus stop on Halsted Street, the one she walked by every night after her shift, and that was when she saw her. An elderly woman sat hunched on a stone bench, shoulders shaking, wearing a thin white nightgown that wouldn't have been warm even on a summer night, let alone when the temperature had dropped to -5. Her gray hair was wild, fluttering in the wind, her lips purple and shuddering as she repeated the same sentence over and over, so faint that Bryn had to lean close to hear it. "Who will water my rosebush?" the old woman said, her voice thin as a thread about to snap, eyes staring into empty space as if she were speaking to someone only she could see. "The rosebush. Who will water the rosebush?" Bryn sat down beside her. She asked her name. The woman didn't remember. Asked where she lived. She shook her head. Asked if there was anyone to call. And the woman only repeated the words about the rosebush, as if that were the last thing left in a mind already wiped clean. Bryn looked at the woman, then at the phone in her hand. She knew she should call the police. That was what anyone would do. But Bryn wasn't just anyone. She was a child raised by the system. Someone who had watched that system grind down people with no one to protect them. She knew exactly what would happen if she called. An ambulance, a hospital, paperwork, then a rotten nursing home where the smell of urine mixed with disinfectant, where they tied people to beds with cloth restraints and called it care. She had lain on beds like that. She had been tied with those same restraints. Bryn slipped the phone into her pocket, took off her only thin jacket, and wrapped it around the old woman's shoulders. Then she knelt down, turned her back, and said softly, "Hold on to my neck. I'll take you home." The woman hesitated for a moment, then her trembling arms circled Bryn's neck. She was so light it made Bryn want to cry. Light as if there were nothing left inside her but bones and fear. Bryn stood up, the woman on her back, and started walking into the snowy night. When she turned the corner of Halsted and 47th, she didn't look across the street. She didn't see the black sedan parked tight to the curb, lights off, engine running, a thin trail of cigarette smoke drifting from a cracked window. She didn't see the figure inside, face obscured by the gloom, watching the old woman on her back with eyes that showed no surprise at all. Bryn only knew that tonight, for the first time in her life, she wasn't bringing an abandoned child home. She was bringing a lost mother home. And she had no idea that this single act would pull her into the center of a war she never could have imagined. 3 weeks passed inside the tiny studio apartment on Halsted Street, and the strangest thing wasn't that a woman with no memory was living with Bryn. It was that for the first time in 27 years, the apartment smelled like a real home. The elderly woman Bryn called Nan didn't remember her name, didn't remember where she lived, didn't remember anything except a rose bush and a wordless lullaby she hummed every night. But her hands remembered. Those hands remembered how to fold paper napkins into perfect 5-pointed stars, remembered how to stir porridge from leftover bread crusts and half a can of red beans until it tasted softly sweet, as if it were some treasured family recipe from a wealthy household, rather than scraps pulled from the nearly expired refrigerator of a waitress who couldn't earn enough to cover rent. Penny was the first child to love the old woman without conditions. The 4-year-old girl with curly blonde hair and wide eyes had never seen anything cruel in the world because Bryn had used her own body as a shield between her child and everything else since the day Penny was born. Penny started calling her Nan on the second day, as if the name had already existed inside her heart, simply waiting for the right person to appear. Every night, after Bryn left for her night shift and the neighbor Dottie came by to help watch her, Nan would sit in the old armchair, lift Penny onto her lap, and sing that wordless lullaby. She remembered only the melody, not the words, but Penny didn't need words. The little girl would close her eyes, rest her head against Nan's chest, and fall asleep in the arms of the grandmother she believed was hers. One afternoon, Bryn came home earlier than usual because the diner was slow, and she stood in the doorway watching Nan sit on the floor with Penny, the two of them surrounded by a pile of white paper stars. Penny picked one up, turned it over in her hands, then looked up and asked in the serious, unintentionally funny voice of a 4-year-old, "Nan, why do you fold stars and not dinosaurs? I like dinosaurs better." Nan smiled. That crooked smile Bryn knew by heart, took Penny's tiny hand, and said, "Because stars keep people from getting lost. Dinosaurs only know how to bite." Penny thought about it for a moment, then nodded as if she'd just heard the deepest truth of her life, and went back to folding stars with Nan even though her own creation looked more like a crumpled ball of paper than a star. Bryn leaned against the wooden frame of the door and cried without making a sound. Not because she was sad, but because she realized that this, the old woman on the floor and her little daughter amid a sea of paper stars, was the thing she had been searching for her entire life without knowing its name. It was family. Bryn had never had a family. She had temporary people, a biological mother who left, foster fathers who hit, a boyfriend who vanished before Penny ever took her first breath. She had only Penny, and Penny was everything. But the two of them were like survivors adrift at sea, clinging to each other with no shore in sight. Nan was the shore. She was the place both mother and child washed up against, and for the first time Bryn felt she didn't have to keep swimming. But fear never left her. It lived low in her belly, cold and heavy, like a stone she swallowed at 12 years old and never spat out. The fear that everything good was temporary, that someone would come and take Nan away, the way everything she'd ever loved had been taken from her. That fear sharpened one morning when Bryn walked Penny to preschool. As she held her daughter's hand through the school gate, her eyes drifted across the street without thinking, and she saw it, the black sedan, exactly like the black sedan she'd glimpsed on the corner of Halsted the night she carried Nan home. The same glossy black paint, the same way it hugged the curb, lights off, engine silent. But someone was inside, because she could see the shape of a person behind the darkened glass. Bryn's heart skipped once, then twice. Then she pushed the feeling away. She told herself that Chicago had millions of black sedans, that she was imagining things from lack of sleep, that no one in the world cared about a poor waitress and a woman with no memory. She kissed Penny's forehead, told her to be good, and went to work, and she didn't look back. But the car was still there when she picked Penny up at 5 in the evening. And that night, as Bryn sat beside the bed watching Nan sleep, listening to the steady rhythm of the old woman's breathing blending with the small, soft breaths of Penny curled up nearby, she leaned down, pulled the blanket up over Nan's shoulders, and whispered in a voice meant only for the dark, "I don't know who you are, but please don't go." While Bryn whispered to the elderly woman inside the tiny apartment on Halsted Street, on the other side of the city, in a penthouse on the 42nd floor overlooking the Chicago River, Knox Ashford sat in the dark, staring at his mother's photograph for the 1,000th time since she disappeared. 24 days. 24 days in which every morning he woke up and needed 3 seconds to remember that his mother still hadn't come home. And those 3 seconds were the cruelest of the day, because in the instant his eyes first opened, he still believed everything was normal. And then memory crashed down like a bucket of ice water straight into his chest. Knox Ashford was a name the entire city whispered in fear. He controlled 12 districts on the south side, owned 6 front restaurants and 2 transport companies everyone knew didn't only move legal cargo. His empire was built on blood, on the silence of people who didn't dare open their mouths, and on a single rule. No one touched Knox Ashford's family, but someone had touched them, and the police didn't care. They opened a file, took notes, asked a few routine questions, then closed it with a line Decker read to him over the phone in a voice trying to stay neutral. Female victim, 68 years old, history of confusion, classification, elderly wandering, priority level low, low priority. His mother, the woman who sold flowers on the corner of Michigan Avenue for 20 years to put him through school, the woman who skipped meals so he could afford books, the woman who held him every night when he was a 10-year-old boy crying after neighborhood kids beat him. That woman had been labeled low priority by the system. Knox had wanted to burn the police station down that night, but he didn't, because burning a police station wouldn't bring his mother home. He remembered the last phone call. 24 days ago, in the afternoon, his phone vibrated while he sat in a meeting room with 6 men who could all have someone killed with a single call. He answered, saw his mother's name on the screen, and heard her voice, warm as always. Teddy, remember to water the rose bush in the garden. It's been so cold lately. I'm afraid it'll die. He murmured agreement, eyes still on the documents on the table, and said, Yes, Mom, I know. Then he hung up. He didn't say anything else. He didn't ask if she'd eaten, if she was cold, if she needed him to come by. Just yes, I know, and the beep that ended the call. 24 days later, Knox stood in his mother's garden staring at the rose bush she loved most. It was wilted, yellow leaves scattered at its base, the stem dry and brittle from not being watered for nearly a month in the cold. He hadn't watered the rose bush. He hadn't managed to do the smallest thing his mother asked. And now she wasn't here to be hurt by that. Instead, her absence itself was what was killing him day by day. Knox. The voice behind him pulled him back from the edge of his thoughts. Trent Gallagher stood there, 26 years old, a young face with eyes deeper than his age, holding out a bottle of water. Trent always brought him water. Since his mother disappeared, he knew Knox forgot to drink, forgot to eat, forgot to sleep. So he brought water every hour, set it beside him without saying anything. A quiet habit only family ever had. Knox took the bottle, didn't drink, but held it because it was Trent, the boy he'd sworn to protect. 12 years earlier, Trent's father, a bodyguard named Gallagher, had taken 3 bullets with his own body so Knox could live. The man died in Knox's arms, blood soaking through a white shirt, and his last words were, "Take care of my boy." Knox had kept that promise. He took in Trent, 14 years old, eyes swollen as he stood beside his father's coffin, and said, "From now on, I'm your family." He taught Trent everything: how to tie a tie, how to read people, how to stay calm when the world collapsed. Trent was the younger brother Knox never had, the only person besides his mother who dared put a hand on his shoulder when he broke down. And for 24 days straight, Trent had been the one beside him the most. He put up flyers with him every night, called hospitals, checked cameras, ran across the city. "I just called 3 more hospitals in the suburbs," Trent said, his voice gentle but firm. "No results yet, but I won't stop. We'll find her." Knox nodded, eyes still fixed on the dying rosebush. He didn't notice that for 24 days, every time he opened a stack of flyers with his mother's face on them, Trent never once looked directly at the photograph. His gaze always drifted slightly aside, or downward, or turned away just enough to avoid facing the woman's face on the paper. It was a detail Knox, lost in desperation, couldn't possibly see. Knox's phone vibrated. A message from an unknown number. No name, no picture, just one line of white text on a black screen. "Are you sure your mother just wandered off, Ashford?" Knox stared at the screen, his jaw clenching so hard the muscle at his temple twitched. He turned to Trent and handed him the phone. Trent read the message, his expression unchanged, then said calmly, Probably some lunatic trying to provoke you. I'll trace the number." Knox nodded and slipped the phone back into his pocket. He didn't know that the person who sent that message had once sat at the Christmas dinner table in this very home. And he had no idea that the younger brother standing beside him, handing him water, promising to find his mother, was the one who had delivered her into the hands of the man who sent that message. A snowstorm crashed down on Chicago on the 24th night, as if the sky itself wanted to bury the city, along with the last of Knox Ashford's hope. The snow didn't fall so much as slash sideways, tiny shards of ice sharp as needles stabbing his skin. The wind screaming through the gaps between buildings with a howl Knox swore sounded like someone calling his name from very far away. He had been walking for 4 hours straight, from Chinatown to Little Village, from Bridgeport to back of the yards, pressing flyers onto every surface the tape could cling to. Trent walked on his left, Decker on his right, both silent because they knew Knox didn't want to hear comfort anymore. Every word of it was meaningless, while the person he loved most was still out there in this cold, alone, or worse than alone, in the hands of someone he didn't know. Just as a gust of wind nearly tore the stack of flyers from Decker's hands, Knox saw the small diner on the corner. The fluorescent light inside flickered weakly through fogged glass like a heartbeat forcing out its last few beats. He didn't go in because he was hungry. He went in because his legs couldn't carry him any farther. Because 24 sleepless nights had turned his bones into something more brittle and exhausted than the steel people liked to imagine him made of. The bell chimed as the glass door opened, and the smell of frying grease and burnt coffee hit him like a memory of the ordinary world, a world he hadn't belonged to for a very long time. The diner was small and sad in the way places that served the poor were often sad. Faded red plastic booths with peeling edges, scratched laminate tabletops scarred by knife marks, an old radio on a shelf playing country music so softly it was only audible when the room went quiet, and a ceiling fan turning lazily even though it was freezing outside, as if someone had forgotten to turn it off since last summer. Only 2 customers sat in the far corner, an old man dozing over his coffee, and a middle-aged woman bent over her phone. Knox took the table by the window. Decker sat across from him, Trent beside him. The soaked flyer in Knox's hand was placed on the table, his mother's photograph blurred by snow, yet her crooked smile was still clear, still warm, still gentle in the way only mothers who truly loved their children ever smiled. Behind the counter, Bryn Holloway was wiping down the laminate with a damp cloth, eyes heavy from a second shift in a row, her thoughts on Penny and Nan at home. When she looked up at the men who had just come in, she knew instantly they weren't ordinary customers. The expensive wool coats, the posture of men used to giving orders, the eyes scanning the room out of habit before sitting down. She meant to ignore them, meant to finish wiping the counter and close up, when her gaze fell on the paper on the table. The photograph. The crooked smile. The silver hair. She froze, the cloth slipping from her hand without her noticing. Her feet nailed to the floor, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. It was Nan, the old woman she had carried home 3 weeks earlier. The woman lying in her bed right now with Penny curled beside her. The woman she called Nan, and Penny called Grandma. The woman she had whispered, "Please don't go to," just last night. And the man who had placed that photograph on the table, the man with dark circles under his eyes and trembling hands, was looking for her. The floor seemed to tilt beneath Bryn's feet. Her mind raced, each conclusion slicing like a knife. If she spoke, this man would come to her apartment and take Nan away. Penny would wake up tomorrow and ask where Nan went with those wide eyes, and Bryn would have to answer, and that answer would crush her child's small heart. The apartment would return to what it was, cold and empty, just the 2 of them, and the smell of damp walls. No paper stars, no red bean porridge, no wordless lullaby, no family. But what if she stayed silent? What if she pretended not to recognize the face, finished cleaning, closed the diner, went home, held Nan and Penny, and lived on as if tonight had never happened? She could keep everything. Nan would keep folding stars. Penny would keep her grandmother. She would keep her family. All she had to do was not open her mouth. All she had to do was stay silent. Bryn looked at the man again. He was staring at the photograph on the table, his fingertips touching his mother's face on the paper, with a tenderness she had never seen in any man before. And his eyes, sunken, red, exhausted, clung to the image as if it were the only thing keeping him tethered to the ground. She knew those eyes. She had seen them in the mirror 15 years earlier, when she was 12, standing behind the orphanage door watching her mother walk away. the eyes of someone abandoned, the eyes of someone who didn't understand why the person they loved most had disappeared. And she realized that if she stayed silent tonight, she would become the thing she hated most in the world. She would become someone who kept a mother from her child, the way the system had kept her from her own mother, the way her mother had chosen to keep herself from her. She would become the one who abandoned, just in a different way. Bryn took a deep breath, so deep her chest ached, and then she stepped out from behind the counter. Bryn stopped at Knox's table, both hands gripping the edge of her apron until her knuckles turned white, and she felt her heart pounding up in her throat, beating so hard she feared that if she opened her mouth, instead of words only her heartbeat would spill out. But she spoke anyway, because the eyes of the man staring at the photograph on the table were identical to the eyes she had seen in the mirror 15 years earlier, and she couldn't let someone with those eyes search for one more day. "Sir," her voice faltered so badly, she had to swallow halfway through and start again. "The woman in that picture, she's living at my place." Time inside the small diner froze. The ceiling fan kept turning. The country music kept playing, but it all dissolved into meaningless noise because Knox Ashford was already on his feet with a speed no man who hadn't slept for 24 nights should have had. The plastic chair crashed backward onto the floor with a dry crack, and he lunged toward Bryn, both hands clamping onto her shoulders with a force she knew would leave bruises. Decker rose instantly, his hand reflexively sliding inside his coat. But Knox didn't look at him, or at anyone else. He looked only at Bryn, with an intensity she had never seen in another human being. "What did you just say?" he shouted, his voice breaking like a string pulled too tight. "Say it again. Where is my mother? Where is she?" His fingers tightened on Bryn's shoulders, and she felt pain. She felt fear. But she didn't step back. She had lived her whole life around violent men, hands that squeezed too hard, voices that shouted too loud. But what kept her still wasn't courage. It was what she saw behind those hands and that roar. Tears. Tears gathered at the corners of Knox's eyes, not falling yet, but trembling there. And behind them wasn't the Mafia boss Chicago feared. It was a son drowning in the pain of losing his mother. Behind Knox, Trent Gallagher heard Bryn's words, and for a tenth of a second his face changed. Not shock, not relief. Something else. Something that looked like fear, as if all the blood drained from his skin in an instant. Pale, pupils tightening, like headlights suddenly thrown onto an animal hiding in the dark, but only for a tenth of a second. Then Trent recovered, so fast no one would have noticed unless they were watching closely. And he stepped toward Knox, with perfectly measured concern, placing a hand on Knox's arm and gently prying Bryn free from his grip. "Brother, calm down. She's helping us." Trent's voice was soft, steady, exactly the voice of a loyal younger brother, trying to keep his older brother from falling apart. He played the part flawlessly, so flawlessly that even Decker nodded, so flawlessly that Knox released Bryn's shoulders and stepped back half a pace, breathing hard, chest rising and falling. But Bryn saw it. She didn't know what it meant, didn't know why Trent's face had gone pale for that brief instant. But her mind, a mind trained for 27 years to survive by reading the expressions of dangerous people, noted the reaction and stored it away in a drawer she didn't yet know when she would open. She turned back to Knox, her eyes still red but her voice steadier now. Steady in the way people who are used to enduring become steady, not because the fear is gone, but because fear has become the foundation of life. "She's safe," she said, her hands gently closing around Knox's wrists, the way she held Penny's hands when her daughter woke from nightmares, a small gesture carrying a weight of comfort no words could explain. "I found her at a bus stop 3 weeks ago. She was freezing. She didn't remember her name, didn't remember where she lived. I brought her home. She's been eating and sleeping there, with me and my daughter." Knox stared at Bryn, his lips moving without sound, as if human language couldn't contain what was rushing through him now. Then Bryn added, her voice smaller, almost a whisper. "And these words weren't meant for the Mafia boss. They were meant for the son standing in front of her. And I know she's your mother. I can see it in your eyes. But these past 3 weeks, she's also been the only person who's felt like a mother to me." Knox looked at Bryn, truly looked at her for the first time since walking into the diner. Not at a waitress in a red apron, not at a woman holding information about his mother, but at a human being, one whose eyes carried wounds like his own, who knew the taste of losing a mother, just in a different way. A way he felt in her trembling voice and the cracked hands holding his wrists. "Take me to her," he said, his voice low now. No shouting, no command, just a plea disguised as an order. "Please. Right now." Bryn nodded, untied her apron, pulled her keys from her bag. She walked toward the door, Knox right behind her, Decker close after, and Trent followed too. But just before stepping outside, he pulled his phone from his pocket and glanced down at the screen, his thumb flicking quickly as if checking something, or sending something, and his face in that moment, when no one was looking, was no longer the face of a loyal younger brother. 3 blocks. Just 3 blocks from the diner to Bryn's apartment on Halstead Street. For an ordinary person, it would take less than 5 minutes to walk. But for Knox Ashford that night, those 3 blocks were longer than the 24 days he had been waiting, longer than the thousands of flyers he had plastered across the city, longer than every road he had ever walked in his life. Because at the end of these 3 blocks could be his mother, or it could be a mistake, a misunderstanding, a final hope crushed beyond repair. And he didn't know if he could survive the second outcome. Knox moved so fast he was almost running. Expensive leather shoes slipping on the ice glazed over the sidewalk. But he didn't slow down. Couldn't slow down, his body pulled forward by an invisible cord he had felt for 24 days, without knowing where it led until tonight. Bryn had to nearly run to keep up, her worn sneakers sliding again and again on the snow, her breath breaking into small white clouds that vanished in the wind. Decker followed behind, eyes sweeping every alley, every darkened corner, a protective instinct that never shut off, even though his boss no longer had the presence of mind to think about danger. Trent walked last, hands buried in his coat pockets, and in the darkness where no one could see, his thumb kept gliding across his phone screen. "Does she eat?" Knox asked without turning around, his voice urgent and raw, as if each question was a breath he had to force out before he suffocated. "What does she eat? Are you feeding her enough? Is she hurt? Any bruises? Does she cry? Does she talk about me?" Bryn answered while walking, her words broken by how fast they were moving. "She eats well. At first she couldn't eat much, so I made thin porridge and increased it slowly. She likes tea with honey. 1 cup every morning. She makes it very carefully, stirs exactly 7 times before she drinks." Knox nearly stumbled, his step faltering for a beat. Tea with honey, 7 turns. He knew that. He had grown up watching his mother at the kitchen table every morning, a steaming cup of honey tea, stirring exactly 7 times because she said 7 was a lucky number, then taking the first sip and closing her eyes, as if it were the happiest moment of her day. He swallowed hard, his voice rougher. "Does she do anything all day? Does she sit still, or does she walk around?" "She folds napkins," Bryn said, still breathless. "Folds them into stars, 5 pointed stars. She folds them all day, very fast, like her hands remember even though her mind doesn't remember anything else. She even teaches my daughter, though Penny's stars look more like crumpled paper balls, and she still tells her they're beautiful." Paper stars. Knox felt his knees weaken, as if someone had pulled the bones from his legs. His mother had folded paper stars since he was a child, hundreds of them scattered around the house. She said stars kept people from getting lost, and every time he traveled, she slipped a paper star into his pocket without telling him, so he would find it when he needed it. "Is there anything else?" he asked, his voice breaking now, no longer able to hide it, each word splintering like glass. "Does she sing? Does she sing anything?" Bryn looked at him and realized the man beside her was no longer a mafia boss. He was turning into something far more fragile, something breaking apart piece by piece with every detail she shared. "Yes," she said more gently. "She sings every night, but she only remembers the melody, not the words. She hums, then her eyes drift toward the window, and sometimes she cries without knowing why. I ask her why she's crying. She shakes her head and says she doesn't know. She just feels a pain in her chest like someone is calling her and she can't remember who it is." Knox stopped. He stood in the middle of the sidewalk, snow settling on his shoulders, his hair, his eyelashes, and he couldn't breathe. The wordless lullaby. It was the song his mother sang to him every night when he was small, a song she made up herself with no words, only melody, because she said words could be forgotten but melodies lived in the bones, in the blood, in the breath. And his mother had been right, because even with her memory gone, she still remembered that melody. She was singing it to the daughter of a stranger waitress, the same song she once sang to him, and she didn't know she was crying because she missed him, because her heart remembered him even when her mind had forgotten. Knox leaned back against a brick wall, one hand gripping the edge, the other pressing to his chest, breathing like a man about to drown. Decker rushed to him and grabbed his shoulder, but Knox lifted a hand to stop him. shaking his head to say he was fine even though he clearly wasn't. He just needed 1 second. 1 second not to collapse in the street. 1 second to believe that everything this young woman was telling him was true, that his mother was at the end of this road, sitting in a small apartment, folding stars, drinking honey tea, singing his lullaby. He pushed himself off the wall, kept walking, and they reached the front of the old apartment building. The iron stairs creaked, paint peeled from the walls. The narrow hallway smelled of dampness and cheap disinfectant. Bryn stopped at the wooden door, keys in her hand, and turned to look at Knox. The yellow hallway light fell across her face, and she said in a voice Knox would never forget for the rest of his life, "Listen to me. She might not recognize you. Some days she remembers a few fragments, and the next day she forgets everything again. Some days she cries for an hour for no clear reason. Some days she's cheerful as if nothing ever happened. Her memory is like water. It slips through her fingers no matter how tightly she tries to hold it. So please, whoever you are, however powerful you are, when you step through this door, please be gentle with her." Knox nodded, his throat so tight he couldn't make a sound. And if Bryn had looked closely, she would have seen that the eyes of the most feared Mafia boss in Chicago at that moment were exactly the eyes of a 7-year-old child standing outside his mother's bedroom door, afraid that when it opened, she wouldn't be there. Bryn turned the key, the lock clicked, and the wooden door swung open, and the first thing that reached Knox wasn't a sight or a sound, it was a smell. Cinnamon. Toasted bread. The 2 scents blended together and spilled out of the small apartment like an invisible hand slamming straight into his chest. So hard he staggered back half a step, his spine hitting the doorframe, and he nearly collapsed because his knees had gone weak without him even realizing when. He knew that smell. He had grown up in it. The tiny kitchen in the old house in Bridgeport, where his mother woke every morning at 5 to toast bread dusted with cinnamon before he went to school, because she said breakfast was the most important meal, and no matter how poor they were, her son had to eat properly. Cinnamon and toast were the scent of his childhood, the scent of safety, the scent of the only thing in his violent life that had never been tainted. And now that scent was pouring out of the tiny studio apartment of a waitress he'd met less than an hour ago, and it struck him more brutally than any bullet he'd ever taken, because bullets only tore through flesh, but cinnamon tore through time, dragging him back 30 years to when he was a boy in oversized clothes, sitting at the kitchen table watching his mother toast bread, and believing the world was a good place. He clung to the doorframe, eyes fixed inside, and he saw her. Ruth Ashford sat in an old armchair draped with a floral blanket Bryn had probably bought at some thrift store, her body angled slightly to the left, in the habit he remembered well, because her spine had troubled her since she was 50, from decades of standing outside selling flowers. And her hands were folding paper napkins into stars, wrinkled fingers precise, creating perfect creases with a speed only hands that had folded tens of thousands of stars could achieve. Curled on her lap was Penny, blonde hair spilling across the floral fabric, fast asleep, with one small hand clutching the edge of Ruth's sweater, as if afraid she might disappear in a dream. The apartment was so small Knox could take it all in from the doorway. The single bed pushed against the wall, the 2-burner stove on a narrow counter, the sink piled with plastic cups meant for a child, and a row of white paper stars lined neatly along the windowsill. 6 stars in perfect formation like sentries, exactly the way his mother used to arrange them on her own windowsill, because she said stars by the window would guide the lost back home. Ruth looked up at the sound of the door, and her eyes warmed when they landed on Bryn, in a way Knox had once believed she reserved only for him. "Bryn," she called, her voice thin but sweet, the voice of a mother calling her daughter. And the name Bryn on her lips carried the same loving cadence Teddy once had when she called him as a child. "Did you bring a guest home? Why didn't you tell me so I could tidy up? Let me make more tea. We still have honey. I saved some in the cupboard." She said our home as if this truly were her home, as if 3 weeks had turned this tiny studio into a place of belonging. And Knox stood in the doorway hearing those 2 words, his chest aching so badly he had to bite the inside of his cheek to keep silent. Penny stirred on Ruth's lap, the sound from the door tugging her from sleep. She opened her eyes groggily, yawned, rubbed them with her small fists, then looked toward the doorway, and her sleepy eyes widened when she saw Knox standing there, the large man in a black suit, snow dusting his shoulders, his face carved from stone, filling nearly the entire frame of the door. Penny tilted her head, studied him from top to bottom, then turned to Bryn and asked in a drowsy seriousness that pierced the heart, "Mommy, is he Santa Claus?" Why isn't he wearing red? For a brief instant, the weight of the entire night cracked apart under a 4-year-old's question. Decker cleared his throat softly to hide an inappropriate laugh. Bryn smiled wearily and smoothed Penny's hair. He's not Santa, sweetheart. He's Mommy's guest. Penny looked at Knox one more time, decided he was less interesting than sleep, turned back, buried her face against Ruth's stomach, and drifted off again. And that gentle moment passed as quickly as it came, because Knox was looking at his mother, and everything else in the world ceased to exist. She was smaller than he remembered, her shoulders thinner, her collarbones more pronounced beneath the light sweater Bryn had likely lent her, her silver hair messier, the lines at her eyes and mouth deeper, as if the past 24 days had taken more from her than time normally would. But her eyes were still warm, those eyes, the light brown eyes he had looked into every day of his childhood. Eyes that cried when he was hurt, smiled when he brought home good grades, dimmed with sorrow every time he stepped further into a criminal life she couldn't pull him back from. Those eyes were still there, still warm, still gentle, still regarding the world with a kindness he couldn't understand how she'd preserved after all she'd endured. But they were looking at him the way one looks at a stranger. There was no spark of recognition, no flicker of memory, only the polite curiosity of an elderly woman regarding a guest her adopted granddaughter had brought home in the middle of a snowstorm. And that, the absence of recognition in his mother's eyes, hurt more than anything Knox Ashford had endured in his 37 years of living. He stood there on the threshold, unable to move his feet, one hand gripping the doorframe like the edge of a cliff, staring at his mother sitting 3 steps away across a distance wider than the Chicago River, deeper than 24 days of desperation, because his mother was here, in front of him, alive, breathing, folding stars. Yet in those warm eyes, he did not exist. Knox didn't remember when his knees hit the floor. He hadn't ordered his body to kneel, hadn't chosen to lower himself before anyone, but his legs folded on their own as if they had been waiting for this moment for 24 days and could not endure another second. Both knees striking the old wooden floor with a dull crack that should have hurt, but he felt no pain. Nothing except the crushing pull in the center of his chest, dragging him toward the woman in the armchair, 3 steps away. He crawled. Knox Ashford, the man Chicago bowed to, crawled across the floor of a studio apartment barely 300 square feet, palms pressed to cold wood, knees dragging, moving toward his mother like a child relearning how to reach the world. He stopped in front of the chair, lifted his face, and raised his right hand, a scarred hand, fingers that had pulled triggers, crushed throats, signed death sentences with a nod, that hand now trembling violently and stopping less than a finger's width from his mother's knee, hovering there, afraid to touch. He was afraid that if he touched her, she would vanish, melt like snow in his palm, because for 24 nights he had dreamed of her, every dream the same, her folding stars while he ran toward her, and with every step closer she drifted farther away, and he woke clutching empty air. So now, with her truly here, flesh and bone, a finger's width away, he didn't dare touch her, because he didn't know if he could survive this being another dream. Mom. A single sound, not a word, the sound of bone breaking, of glass shattering, the sound of a 37-year-old man trying to cram 24 days of desperation, 30 years of guilt, and a lifetime of unspoken love into one syllable, and that syllable broke in half. The first part a call, the second a sob. Ruth looked down at the man kneeling at her feet, tilted her head, light brown eyes blinking, and there was no recognition on her face, no spark of memory, only the gentle confusion of an old woman who didn't understand why a large man was kneeling before her and crying. Silence stretched, 3 seconds, 5 seconds, 10 seconds, each one a knife through Knox's chest as he looked into his mother's eyes, and she looked back with the eyes one gives a stranger, polite, curious, empty, with no him inside them, no 37 years inside them, no Teddy inside them, and in the cruelest moment of his life, he thought that maybe not finding her would have hurt less than finding her and being forgotten. Then Ruth reached out her hand, slowly, a thin, wrinkled hand, fingers fragile yet once stronger than anything he'd known, reaching for his face, and Knox froze, breath caught, body turning to stone. Her fingers touched his cheek, slid along his jaw, up to his temple, around behind his left ear, and stopped, on the scar less than an inch long just behind his ear where the skin was thin and sensitive, the scar from when he was 7 and fell off his bike on the Bridgeport Hill, his head hitting the curb, blood soaking half his face, and Ruth had scooped him up and run 3 blocks to the nearest hospital barefoot because she'd been washing dishes when she heard him cry. Her feet cutting on snow and gravel, but she didn't stop, didn't slow, just ran, holding him tight and repeating, "It's okay, teddy bear. Mommy's here. It's okay." Ruth's fingers rested on the scar, and something changed in her eyes. Not memory, deeper than memory, older than memory. Something in bone and blood and breath, something her body kept even when her mind was wiped. The same way she still remembered the lullaby melody, the 7 turns of tea, the folding of stars. Her fingertip pressed lightly into the scar. Her lips trembled, her eyes filled, and she whispered teddy bear. Knox broke open, not crying but breaking. Like a dam held too long, finally bursting, a flood tearing through without control or restraint. He buried his face in his mother's lap, forehead pressed to her thigh, arms wrapping tight around her waist, holding her like he was 7, like he was 10, and crying after being beaten. Like he was 18 the last time he ever let himself cry in front of her, before stepping into a world where tears meant death. His shoulders shook, not shook, but convulsed. His whole body racked as if an earthquake were happening only inside him. And the sound he made wasn't a cry, but a roar swallowed inward, raw and tearing. The sound of a man who hadn't cried in 20 years finally crying for all of it. Ruth didn't fully understand. She didn't clearly remember who he was. But her hand settled on his head, stroking his hair slowly, rhythmically, the same rhythm she had used thousands of nights when he was small. And she began to hum the wordless lullaby, the melody her body remembered even when her mind forgot. And she didn't know why she was crying, but her tears fell with his, as if her heart recognized her son before her brain could. Penny woke fully this time, sat up on Ruth's lap, wide-eyed at the large man sobbing at her grandmother's feet. And she wasn't afraid. 4-year-olds aren't afraid of the things adults fear. She just tilted her head, frowned, then turned to Bryn by the door, with tears streaming down her face, and asked in a tiny voice, "Mommy, where does he hurt?" Bryn knelt, pulled Penny into her arms, and said in a voice she tried to keep from breaking, and still broke inside where no one can see, "Sweetheart." By the door, Trent Gallagher leaned against the frame, head bowed, shoulders slumped, the picture of a man deeply moved by a reunion between mother and son. Decker stood beside him, eyes red, turned away because he didn't want anyone to see the most loyal bodyguard of Knox Ashford crying. But if anyone, even one person in that room, had looked closely at Trent's eyes then, they would have seen something chilling. His eyes were dry, completely dry, not a trace of tears, his posture perfect, head bowed, shoulders heavy. But the eyes looking down at the floor weren't the eyes of someone moved. They were the eyes of someone calculating. 5 minutes. Just 5 minutes. That was all the peace life allowed Knox Ashford to taste before ripping it from his hands once again. But those 5 minutes, 5 minutes sitting on the old wooden floor at his mother's feet, holding her wrinkled hand in his scarred one, were worth more than everything he had ever owned. Worth more than 12 Southside districts. More than 6 front restaurants. More than the $1 million empire he had built on blood and other people's fear. Knox sat on the floor with his back against the side of the armchair, his head tilted so his cheek rested against his mother's knee, and he held her hand. He didn't grip it tightly because he was afraid of hurting her, afraid his rough, calloused fingers would scrape that fragile skin, so he held it lightly, lighter than he had ever held anything in his life, the way one lifts a fledgling fallen from its nest, enough to keep it safe but never enough to crush it. Ruth didn't fully remember who he was. She called him Teddy Bear, but there was still fog in her eyes, still gaps where memory had been torn away and not yet stitched back together. Yet she knew she belonged to this man. Her body knew even when her mind didn't, so she kept stroking his hair, fingers threading through his short curls slowly and rhythmically, like an ancient ritual her hands performed by instinct. Bryn stood in the kitchen, making tea. She didn't ask Knox what he wanted, didn't ask if he wanted tea. She simply reached for a cup, boiled the water, dropped in the tea, then opened the cupboard for the jar of honey she bought for Nan, because she liked honey tea. She stirred 7 times, exactly as Nan had taught her, because Nan said 7 was a lucky number, and Bryn didn't believe in luck, but she believed in Nan, so she stirred exactly 7 times. She set the cup beside Knox without a word, and Knox looked at it, at the honey dissolving slowly into the hot water, forming golden spirals, and he knew she had stirred 7 times, because the surface swirled the way his mother always did. and he wanted to say thank you, but his throat still wouldn't work after the storm of crying. So he only nodded, and Bryn understood, because she was someone who didn't need words to understand pain. No one spoke. The country music from the diner was 3 blocks away now. The sound of the snowstorm outside was softened by thick glass. Inside this tiny room there was only breathing, the faint ticking of the kettle cooling, Ruth humming the wordless lullaby, and Penny's steady breaths on the armchair where Bryn had settled her again, after Ruth stood so Knox could sit closer. The room was barely 300 square feet. Low ceiling, peeling paint, creaking floorboards, furniture that was secondhand or found on the street. But right now, on a January snowstorm night in Chicago, this room held something Knox's 42nd floor penthouse, with Italian leather sofas and velvet curtains and polished oak tables never could. Peace. Knox felt it, in the warmth of his mother's hand, in the cinnamon lingering in the air, in the breathing of a 4-year-old sleeping an arm's length away, in the yellow light touching the row of paper stars lined on the windowsill. He felt it, and realized this was what he had been searching for the wrong way his entire life, looking for it in power, in money, in other people's fear, when it was here all along in a tiny apartment on Halsted Street, between an elderly woman with no memory, a poor waitress, and a 4-year-old child. Then Penny woke. This time she didn't fall back asleep, but sat up, rubbed her eyes, looked around, and when her gaze landed on Knox sitting on the floor beside the armchair, she wasn't afraid or shy. She climbed down and walked straight to him. She stopped in front of him, her height level with his chest where he sat, and looked at him with the serious, wide-eyed focus only a 4-year-old can have. Serious enough to be almost funny, and yet sharp enough to ache. Penny reached behind her back and pulled out a paper star. Not one of Ruth's perfect 5-pointed stars. This was Penny's star. Crooked, 1 point bent. The paper crumpled because her small hands didn't yet know how to press clean folds. But it was a star. It had 5 points, even if they weren't even, and she had kept it hidden like a treasure. Nan says whoever holds a star won't get lost, Penny said softly but clearly, looking straight into Knox's eyes with the absolute sincerity only a child who doesn't know how to lie can have. You've been lost for a long time, haven't you? Take this, so you won't be lost anymore. Knox looked at the paper star in Penny's tiny hand, then at his own, large and rough and layered with scars, knuckles hardened, nails cut short from a life used to holding guns, a hand that had taken lives, built an empire on pain, clenched countless things and kept none of them. He reached out, and Penny placed the paper star in his palm. It weighed nothing, fragile enough to be blown away by a breath of wind, crooked and imperfect. And Knox closed both hands around it carefully, gently, cradling that scrap of paper as if it were the most precious thing ever given to him. And the truth was, it was because it was the first time in his life a child had given him something not out of fear, not out of need, but out of trust. He pressed his hands together around the star and felt its thin edges against his skin, and he wished time would stop right here, in this moment, in this small room that smelled of cinnamon and toast, with his mother stroking his hair, with a 4-year-old smiling at him because he held a star, with Bryn by the kitchen watching them with wet eyes and a tired but peaceful smile. He wished time would stop, but time didn't, and those 5 minutes of peace ended with Ruth's voice, when the fog in her eyes suddenly cleared and was replaced by something sharp and panicked and unbearably painful. Something Knox felt before she even spoke, felt through the sudden grip of her hand on his shoulder, thin fingers clawing into his jacket with a strength a 68-year-old woman shouldn't have. And he looked up at his mother and saw fear, not the vague fear of confusion, but a specific, vivid terror, the fear of someone remembering something she desperately wished she never had. They came to our house, Teddy. Ruth's voice changed completely. No longer the thin, gentle voice of the old woman who folded paper stars and sang lullabies to her grandchild, but the voice of a woman dragged back into a memory her body had tried to bury for 3 weeks, a memory that clawed its way out, burst the coffin open, and crawled into this warm room with all its original brutality intact. The fog vanished from her eyes, sharpening into the eyes Knox remembered, the eyes of the strong mother who raised him in poverty. But now those eyes were filled with terror, not vague or confused terror, but sharp and precise, as if she were seeing exactly what had happened all over again, and each image was a blade slicing her from the inside. Ruth's thin fingers dug into Knox's shoulder, piercing through the expensive wool of his coat until he felt her nails bite into his skin, and she pulled him closer, her face no more than a hand's width from his, her breath fast and shallow, the pulse in her neck jumping wildly. "Men with snake tattoos on their wrists," she said, each word forced out like shards of glass being spat from her throat. "They banged on the door at night. I was watering the rose bush. They didn't say anything, just blindfolded me with black cloth, shoved me into a car, and drove. I screamed, but no one heard. Then they took me into a basement. Dark, cold, concrete floor. The smell of damp and motor oil, they told me." She stopped, eyes squeezed shut, and when she opened them, tears streamed down her lined cheeks. "They told me you were dead, Teddy. They said you'd been shot in a hit. They said no one would come looking for me because you were gone." Knox stopped breathing. He sat there on the wooden floor, Penny's paper star still resting in his left palm, and he felt his blood freeze drop by drop as if liquid nitrogen were being pumped through his veins. His mother hadn't wandered off. She'd been kidnapped. For 24 days he'd plastered flyers, searched hospitals, scoured nursing homes, believing she was lost in confusion, while in reality, she'd been locked in a dark basement, told her son was dead, forced to live with the pain of losing him with no way to know the truth. He pictured his mother, 68 years old, alone in the cold, believing her child was gone, and something erupted in his chest. Not the way it shattered when she called him teddy bear, that had been joy. This was fury, thick and black and molten, flooding his veins and burning everything it touched. "Tell me more, Mom," he said, his voice no longer trembling or breaking but flat as a frozen lake, the kind of voice anyone who knew Knox Ashford feared more than shouting. Ruth swallowed, her gaze fixed on empty air as if replaying a film she couldn't turn off. "They fed me once a day, old bread and water. Sometimes they forgot even that. I didn't know day from night because there were no windows, just a small vent like a rice sack in the corner, too high to reach. I heard them talking through the iron door, about deals, about territory, about sending a message to Ashford. And I didn't understand, because they told me you were dead, but they kept saying your name." She paused, drew a shaking breath. Then one night they were drunk. I heard bottles breaking, shouting, fists. I looked at the vent and realized if I climbed the wooden crate in the corner I could reach it. I climbed up, grabbed the edge, pulled myself through. It was small, Teddy. I had to twist. My hands tore on the metal, blood everywhere, my knees scraped raw on the concrete, but I didn't stop. I fell outside, got up, and ran. I ran barefoot, not knowing where I was, until my lungs burned and my legs gave out, and I collapsed at a bus stop. After that, the world became a freezing blur, my mind drifting like a thick fog where I could only cling to the image of my rosebush, until I finally felt the warmth of that girl's home. She looked at Bryn with a protective love so deep Bryn had to turn away. Knox sat motionless, his right hand clenched into a fist on his knee, knuckles white, veins standing out like steel wires. "What did they know about me, Mom?" he asked, his voice flat as a blade. Ruth met his eyes and understood the question. "They knew everything," she said quietly. "They knew you drink ginger tea every morning. They knew about the rose garden. They knew you visit me every Wednesday afternoon. They knew I fold stars, knew what I sing, knew how I make tea. They knew everything, Teddy. Like they lived in our house. Ginger tea, the rose garden, Wednesdays. Those details weren't in any file. No camera recorded morning tea. No outsider knew his Wednesday visits because he'd shared that schedule only with his closest circle. 7 people, only 7. Ruth closed her eyes, brow creasing as she reached for something deeper. "There was a voice," she whispered, so softly it almost disappeared. "I heard it through the basement door. It spoke to the kidnappers, gave them orders, and that voice." She opened her eyes and looked straight at Knox, and he saw not just fear but the pain of remembering a betrayal she wished she never had. "I've heard that voice at our Christmas table. I don't remember the face, but I remember the voice because it used to call me sister. Teddy, that person called me sister. Christmas dinner. The floor seemed to tilt. Every Christmas there were only 5 people at that table. Him, his mother, Decker, Trent, and Boyd Kessler. The man Knox once called an ally, who sat in that house, ate Ruth's turkey, drank Knox's wine, and called her sister with a warm smile that Knox now realized might have been a mask. Knox rose slowly, his movements calm in the way only the most dangerous men ever are, the calm of a storm just before it tears everything apart. He scanned the room, Bryn by the stove, frightened, Penny asleep again on the armchair, Decker in the hallway, his expression shifting from emotion to alertness as he felt the air change, and at the doorway, where Trent Gallagher had stood since they entered, where he'd bowed his head with dry eyes in perfect grief, where he'd played the most loyal shadow Knox had. There was nothing. The space was empty. Trent was gone. No footsteps. No goodbye. Gone in the 3 minutes since Ruth's memory returned, as if he'd been waiting for this exact moment, knew precisely when to run, and fled before her recollection could speak his name. Decker ran into the hallway before Knox could say a word. The instinct of a 42-year-old bodyguard who had been at Knox's side for 15 years, needing no command to understand that when Trent vanished at the exact moment Ruth began to remember, it was not coincidence. It was confession. Decker returned in less than a minute, his face set like stone but his eyes carrying something Knox had never seen in all those years. Pain. He left the building 3 minutes ago, Decker said quietly, his gaze fixed on the floor because he did not want Knox to see what was burning in his eyes. The hallway cameras caught him exiting through the back door, and he made a phone call. 12 seconds long, the moment he stepped outside. I checked the number. It matches the number that sent you the anonymous message earlier today. The number that had texted, "Are you sure your mother just wandered off?" Ashford. Knox stood in the tiny apartment on Halsted Street, Penny's paper star still resting in his left palm, staring at the empty space where Trent had been standing. The doorway that only 3 minutes earlier had held the ghost of the brother he had raised, and he understood everything. Not with logic, but with the way a knife in the chest needs no explanation to know. It hurts. It simply hurts. And he knew. And that knowing was more brutal than any bullet he had ever taken, because a bullet only pierces flesh while betrayal pierces the soul. Trent Gallagher. The 14-year-old boy with swollen eyes, standing beside his father's coffin, the child Knox had taken by the hand out of the cemetery and told, "From now on, I'm your family," the boy Knox had taught to tie a tie on his first morning of high school, adjusting the knot at his collar while the kid stood in front of the mirror in Knox's house and smiled for the first time since his father died. Knox remembered everything. He remembered the nights Trent was 16 and burning with fever. Knox sitting by his bed, cold cloth on his forehead, not sleeping, not leaving, because his father had asked him to look after the boy, and Knox Ashford kept his promises, even if it cost him his life. He remembered taking Trent to his father's grave for the first time after the funeral, the boy standing there, thin shoulders shaking in the wind, and Knox placing a hand on his shoulder and saying, "Your father was the best man I ever knew. I will never let you be alone." He remembered Trent at 20, completing a job on his own for the first time, coming back with a bright smile and saying, "I did it, brother." And Knox clapping his shoulder, proud like an older brother, prouder than when his empire expanded by another district. And he remembered the last 24 days. Every morning Trent brought him a bottle of water because he knew Knox forgot to drink. Every night, Trent stood beside him pasting flyers in the freezing wind, hands numb, voice steady, saying, "We'll find her, brother, I promise." Every time Knox broke, Trent was the only one who dared sit beside him, place a hand on his shoulder, stay silent with him when no one else dared come close. And through all 24 days, every word of comfort, every bottle of water, every flyer Trent pressed onto a wall, every promise that they would find her, all of it had been lies. Trent knew. He had known where Knox's mother was from the first day. He knew she was locked in a dark basement, fed once a day, told her son was dead. He knew everything, and still stood beside Knox every night, watched him tape his mother's face to walls, watched him tremble in despair, watched him die from the inside, and handed him water to drink, because that was his role, the loyal younger brother, and he played it perfectly for 24 days, without a single slip, without a crack in his voice, except for one tiny detail Knox only now understood. Trent never looked straight at his mother's photo on the flyers. His eyes always drifted aside, always lowered, always turned away, because no matter how skilled an actor is, he cannot look directly into the eyes of the person he has betrayed without revealing something. Knox recalled the moment in the diner when Bryn said she was at my house, and Trent's face went pale for a tenth of a second. Not shock, fear. Fear that everything was about to be exposed, and he had covered it by stepping in, prying Knox's hands from Bryn's shoulders, playing the good man, saying, "Calm down. She's helping us. Flawless, flawlessly terrifying." Knox remembered the anonymous message. "Are you sure your mother just wandered off?" Ashford, and Trent's calm reply. "Probably some lunatic fishing for attention. I'll trace the number." He never traced it. Of course he didn't, because he knew exactly who sent it. Because it was Boyd Kessler, the man who had sat at his mother's Christmas table, called Ruth's sister, eaten her turkey, raised a glass to family, and Trent had been the bridge. The one who handed over the information, the schedule, the habits, everything only family knew. Handed Knox's mother to the enemy like merchandise. Knox turned to Decker, and his voice was so flat that Bryn by the stove felt the hair on her arms rise, because she understood that a voice that calm was more dangerous than any scream she had ever heard. "Lock it down," Knox said. "Call everyone back to the estate. No one leaves. No one uses a phone. And find Trent. Find him for me." Decker nodded, pulled out his phone, stepped into the hallway, and Knox heard his voice turn sharp and fast, issuing orders to the network of 200 men spread across 12 southern districts that no one would sleep tonight, no one would rest, until Trent Gallagher was found. Knox stood alone in the room. Ruth sat in her chair, drained white by the memories that had just torn through her. Penny slept on the armchair, innocent, unaware. Bryn stood by the stove, arms wrapped around herself, frightened but unmoving, and Knox opened his left hand and looked down. Penny's paper star was still there, crooked, one point bent, wrinkled from where he had unconsciously clenched his fist while Ruth spoke. But it was still there, still a star, still fragile and small, and meaningless to anyone else in the world. But to him in that moment, it was the only thing keeping him from falling through the floor. He looked at the star and thought of Trent, and he realized that through the last 24 days, the greatest pain had not been losing his mother, because his mother had been found. She was sitting 2 steps away, alive, breathing, remembering him. The greatest pain tonight was losing the brother he had raised, taught, loved, sworn to protect. The brother who sold his mother to the enemy and then stood beside him for 24 days, watched him die by inches, and handed him water to drink. 3 armored black sedans lined up in front of the old apartment building on Halsted Street, engines rumbling softly in the snowy night, white exhaust blooming into the cutting cold. Knox carried his mother into the car himself, not letting anyone else touch her, his arms cradling her like a child, so gentle that Bryn could hardly believe this was the same man who had grabbed her shoulders hard enough to leave bruises less than an hour earlier. Ruth rested her head against her son's chest, eyes closed, drained by the memories that had wrung her dry, and Knox slid into the back seat of the armored vehicle, keeping her on his lap, one arm wrapped around her back, the other holding her hand, and he did not let go the entire drive. Bryn sat opposite him with Penny asleep in her arms, staring through the darkened window as the city she had lived in for 27 years slipped away behind her. The diner where she worked, the bus stop where she found Nan, the corner where she carried her home, all of it shrinking, fading, as if she were being swallowed by another world she did not belong to and did not know if she would ever escape. The car stopped in front of Knox's estate by the Chicago River, and Bryn had to bite her lip to keep from gasping. This was not a house, it was a fortress. Walls of glass and gray stone rose in the snow like a sleeping beast. A steel gate nearly 13 feet high opening by remote control, spiked metal fencing running along the riverbank, security cameras blinking red on every corner. And as the car passed through the gate, Bryn counted at least 6 men dressed in black scattered through the shadows, each with something bulging beneath his coat that she knew was not a wallet. Inside, the estate was so vast, Bryn felt like she was stepping into a museum rather than a home. Marble floors, ceilings over 13 feet high, crystal chandeliers, a sweeping staircase curling to the 2nd floor, and a massive glass wall overlooking the Chicago River flowing silently through the night, its surface reflecting city lights like millions of shattered stars. Everything here was the opposite of the 30-square-meter studio apartment that only hours earlier had been filled with the smell of cinnamon and peace. And Bryn held Penny tighter, feeling herself shrink amid all that luxury, small and lost like a grain of sand in a palace. A servant led Bryn and Penny to a 2nd-floor sitting room, while Knox carried Ruth into the master bedroom, laid her on the bed, tucked her in, and sat beside her until she fell asleep. Ruth caught Bryn's wrist before they parted, her thin fingers tight around it, and said in a tired but painfully lucid voice, "Stay with me, Bryn. I'm afraid." Then she looked straight into Bryn's eyes and added more slowly, as if weighing every word. "But don't stay too long." Bryn did not understand the second sentence then, but she nodded, kissed Ruth's forehead, and let Knox take her. Night settled. The estate sank into silence, but it was a false silence, the kind that comes from too many people awake, too many soft footsteps in the halls, too many murmured voices over radios. Bryn lay on a bed larger than her old apartment. Penny curled beside her asleep, but Bryn could not sleep. She never slept well in unfamiliar places. It was a survival habit from foster care, where she learned that sleeping deeply in someone else's house was the most dangerous thing she could do, because she never knew who might open her door in the middle of the night. So she always slept with one eye open, always facing the door, always knowing the nearest exit. She listened to her heartbeat, counted it, then decided lying still would drive her mad. So she rose quietly, tucked the blanket around Penny, and stepped out. She walked the second-floor hallway barefoot on cold stone, eyes scanning every corner by instinct, logging doors, windows, staircases, emergency exits, exactly the way she did every time she was sent to a new foster home, because the first step to surviving was knowing how to run. She went downstairs for water, and that was when she saw it. A phone lay on the granite kitchen counter near the sink, half hidden by a roll of paper towels. She recognized at once that it was not Knox's or Decker's, because the case had a long scratch and a small sticker on one corner she had glimpsed earlier when Trent scrolled through his phone on the walk from the diner to her apartment. He had forgotten it or dropped it in his rush to leave, and no one had picked it up because no one knew it was there. Bryn lifted the phone. The screen lit up at her touch, and before it locked, she saw 3 missed calls on the notification bar. All 3 from a contact saved under a single letter, K. 3 missed calls from K within the last 20 minutes. She could not unlock the phone, but she did not need to. She knew it mattered, and she knew it had to go to the right person. She found Decker and handed it to him, and he recognized it as Trent's and unlocked it using a backup passcode stored in Knox's security system for all Inner Circle members. What appeared on the screen hardened Decker's face into something Bryn had never seen on a 42-year-old man. Something caught between fury and revulsion. Message after message between Trent and Boyd Kessler, Knox's mother's visitation schedule, diagrams of Ruth's garden, details of her daily routines, and the final message, sent 17 minutes before Trent vanished from the Halstead apartment. Just 6 words long. The old woman remembers now, needs to be handled. Bryn read those 6 words over Decker's shoulder and felt the blood in her veins turn to ice. Needs to be handled. She knew what that meant. She did not live in this world, but she was not stupid, and those words meant someone was coming to silence Ruth permanently before she could say anything else. Decker ran to find Knox, but Bryn did not wait. She sprinted up the stairs, bare feet slapping marble, burst into Ruth's room, and her 27 years of survival instincts ignited at full force. She locked the door, pulled the heavy curtains tight over the windows, then threw her weight into shoving the massive wooden wardrobe in front of the door, pushing with her shoulder, her back, all of her 117 pounds, until it wedged tight against the door and no one could open it from outside. It was reflex. The reflex of a 10-year-old girl who used to drag a wardrobe in front of her bedroom door every night in her second foster home, because she knew if the door could open, she would not survive the night. She ran to the other room, lifted Penny from the bed without waking her, cradled her, and returned to Ruth's room. Ruth was awake now, eyes wild from the noise, and Bryn sat on the edge of the bed, Penny in one arm, Ruth's hand in the other, and said in a voice she did not know she possessed until that night, calm, hard, steady as steel, "No one is touching you. I'm here." Ruth looked at Bryn, at the fire in her eyes in the locked darkness, at the way she held Penny with one arm and Ruth with the other, a living shield of flesh and bone between her and anything that dared approach, and she whispered with the weight of prophecy, "You're stronger than you think, Bryn." She was right. No attack came to the estate that night. Knox and Decker stopped every threat before it reached the steel gate, flooded the grounds with guards, turned the fortress into an impenetrable shell. But that was not what mattered. What mattered was that before Knox could protect his mother, Bryn already had, with cracked hands, bare feet, a wardrobe shoved with her shoulder, with the survival instincts of a child raised in violence who had turned pain into strength, and that night Bryn Holloway was no longer a poor waitress. Knox owed a debt to. She was a warrior. They found Trent in an abandoned warehouse to the south, in an old industrial zone near the docks where the smell of machine oil and river water blended into a cold, metallic stench that clung to skin. He had not gotten far, because Knox's network sealed every exit from the 12 southern districts faster than his legs could run. Every road, every alley, every bus depot, every train station watched, and Trent Gallagher, though he had lived inside that system for 12 years, had forgotten one thing. He lived there because Knox allowed it. And when Knox wanted the system to turn and bite him, it would bite without hesitation. Decker called at 3:17 in the morning. Trent was at warehouse number 9 on Ashland, alone, unarmed, sitting on the concrete floor among empty cargo crates, as if he had run there and then had no idea where else to go. Knox drove there in silence, the radio off, not speaking to Decker beside him, staring into the darkness beyond the windshield and feeling something in his chest, heavier than rage, heavier than betrayal, something it took him minutes to name. Grief. Not a light grief, but the kind thick as molten lead, the kind that filled his chest cavity and dragged his heart downward until breathing hurt. Because he was about to face the brother he had raised for 12 years, and he knew that after tonight he would lose him, not by death, but in a way worse than death. Lost because he had chosen to betray Knox, while Knox would have died for him. Warehouse number 9 was pitch dark, a single fluorescent bulb hanging from exposed wiring flickering weak yellow light, and beneath it, Trent Gallagher knelt on the cold concrete, head bowed, shoulders shaking, and when Knox entered, when the sound of leather shoes echoed across the floor, Trent looked up, and Knox saw his face soaked with tears, eyes red and swollen, and in a cruel instant Knox remembered the last time he had seen Trent cry like this. 12 years earlier, the 14-year-old boy standing beside his father's coffin. "Knox," Trent said, his voice breaking, tears and mucus streaking his face. His features crumpled like crushed paper, and he did not stand. He stayed on his knees, hands braced on the concrete, head dropping until his forehead nearly touched the floor. "Kessler promised me my own territory. He promised I wouldn't have to live under anyone's weight anymore. I'm tired, Knox. I'm tired of being your shadow my whole life. Everywhere I go, I'm Knox Ashford's brother. Everything I do is because of Knox Ashford. Even breathing feels like it's because of Knox Ashford. I only thought we'd hold her for a few days. Just a few days so Kessler would have leverage. Then she'd be released. I didn't think they'd keep her that long. I didn't think they'd tell her you were dead. I swear to you I didn't know." Knox stood 3 steps away, looking down at him, and he was silent for a long time, long enough that Trent's sobs echoed through the empty warehouse, bouncing off concrete walls, and the sound was so much like the 14-year-old crying at his father's coffin that Knox clenched his teeth to keep his face from changing. He looked at Trent and did not see a 26-year-old traitor kneeling there. He saw the 14-year-old boy in the cemetery, eyes swollen, shoulders sharp beneath an oversized, borrowed black suit, watching his father's coffin lowered into the ground and not understanding why the world had taken the only person he had. He remembered his own hand closing around that small hand in the cemetery, gripping tight, saying, "I'll take care of you. Your father asked me to, and I'll never leave you alone." He had kept that promise. For 12 years he kept it. He gave Trent a home, an education, a position, a level of trust he gave no one but his mother and Decker. He taught him how to tie a tie, how to read people, how to survive in a world where one wrong step could mean death. He thought he was raising a brother. He didn't know he was raising a snake that could cry. And now that snake was kneeling at his feet, tears streaming, saying he was tired of living in Knox's shadow, tired of being a cheap version of Knox Ashford. And Knox understood. He understood because he wasn't a monster. He knew how heavy his shadow was, knew that standing beside him meant no one else was seen. And maybe Trent was telling the truth. Maybe he really had been suffocating for 12 years. Maybe every time Knox clapped his shoulder and said, "Good job," Trent heard, "Good job because you did exactly what I told you." And maybe that killed him a little every day. Knox understood, but understanding didn't mean forgiveness. "Your father died because of me," Knox said, and his voice was no longer flat. It trembled, the way a man's voice trembles when he's using every ounce of strength not to crumble. "Gallagher took 3 bullets so I could live. He asked me one thing before he died: take care of my son. And I did. For 12 years I took care of you. Not because you were a tool, not because I needed a shadow, but because I promised your father, and because I considered you my brother." He paused, swallowed hard, and when he continued, each word fell heavy as stone. "You sold my mother to Kessler to escape my shadow. Your father died protecting me, and you sold my mother to run from me. Do you know how long she was in that basement? Do you know what they told her? They told her I was dead. My mother is 68 years old, alone in the dark, believing her son was gone. And you knew. You knew for 24 days, and you still brought me water every morning." Trent screamed, the sound ripping through the warehouse. "I'm sorry. I was wrong. Knox, you can do anything to me. Kill me if you want, but please believe me, I didn't want her hurt. Knox turned his back. He turned away from Trent mid-sentence and spoke to Decker in a voice stripped of emotion, hollow as the warehouse itself. Just 2 words. "Take him." Then he walked toward the door. Behind him, Trent screamed his name. "Knox! Knox! Brother! Knox!" The cries ricocheting through the warehouse, over and over, and each time his name was screamed, it sounded less like a traitor's plea, and more like a 14-year-old boy calling for his father in a cemetery. And Knox bit his lip until he tasted blood, but he didn't turn back, didn't look back, didn't stop, because he knew if he turned and met Trent's eyes one more time he would forgive him. And he couldn't, not because he didn't want to, but because his mother had spent 24 days in a basement, and he had no right to forgive in her place. Knox stepped outside into the snowy night, Trent's screams still echoing from inside, growing fainter as Decker led him deeper into the building. He stood there, snow settling on his shoulders, and he opened his hand. Penny's paper napkin star lay there, more crumpled than before, because he had been clenching his fist through the entire confrontation without realizing it. Clenching until one point of the star nearly tore, fragile and close to breaking, just like everything he was holding on to in his life. Knox did not rest. He did not return to the estate, did not change his clothes, did not wash the taste of blood from his lip where he had bitten down when he turned his back on Trent. He slid into the back seat of the armored car, met Decker's eyes in the rearview mirror, and said only one word: "Everything." And Decker understood. 15 years beside Knox meant he needed nothing more to know that everything meant the Iron Serpents would not exist by sunrise. The first stop was the warehouse on Racine Street, where the Iron Serpents staged their goods before pushing them south. 12 men with snake tattoos on their wrists, the same tattoos Knox's mother had described when she spoke of the men who banged on her door that night. Those 12 men were inside, counting money when the steel door blew open, and Knox's people poured in. Glass shattered. Tables crashed. Screams were cut short mid-breath. Knox did not go inside. He leaned against the car, looked up at the Chicago sky where snow still fell, and waited. When his men came back out, he moved on. The second stop was the bar on Loomis Street, an Iron Serpent's front where Kessler met clients and partners. This time Knox walked through the front door, across floors crunching with broken glass beneath his shoes, past overturned tables, and on the wall he saw a framed photograph. Boyd Kessler shaking hands with a man Knox did not recognize, both smiling with the bar sign behind them. Knox stood there and studied Kessler's face in the photo, the round face, the wide smile, the eyes half closed like he was always telling a joke. The face Knox had seen for 10 years at meetings, at dinner tables, at Christmas in his mother's house. Knox pulled the picture from the wall and smashed it to the floor, glass exploding into pieces, and stepped over it without looking back. The third stop was the apartment on Throop Street, where 3 senior Iron Serpents members were hiding after word spread that the first 2 locations had been erased. They were not hidden well enough. No one ever hid well enough when Knox Ashford wanted them found. Knox walked out of the Throop Street apartment at 4:37 in the morning, the headlights of the armored car blazing white in his face. And in that harsh light Decker saw blood on his hands, on both palms, on the cuffs of his white shirt, even along the edge of his coat, dark red already drying to brown where it had sat longer, not his blood. Knox looked down at his hands beneath the headlights and felt nothing. No satisfaction, no relief, no regret, only emptiness, a vast hollow in his chest where the rage that had burned for hours had finally burned out, leaving ash, cold and gray. 3 Iron Serpent sites erased in 4 hours, the Southern distribution network severed. 11 members captured and handed over to the Underground's own methods. But Knox did not care about numbers. He cared about one man, and that man was in Warehouse 13 on Canal Street, the last place Boyd Kessler had left after a night in which the Iron Serpent's empire collapsed like dominoes. When Knox entered Warehouse 13, Boyd Kessler sat on a wooden chair in the center, hands bound behind his back, face bruised, shirt torn, yet his eyes were calm in the way only men who had lived in darkness long enough could be calm. The calm of someone who knew he was about to die, and had accepted long ago that death was part of the trade. Kessler was 52, salt and pepper hair, solid build, weathered face with a long scar running from his temple to his left cheek, the scar from the ambush in 2017, the night Kessler had saved Knox. 9 years earlier, Knox had been ambushed by 2 Iron Serpent's gunmen in an alley behind the Michigan Avenue restaurant, and Boyd Kessler, then still an ally, was the only one who charged in, dropped one shooter, dragged Knox out, the scar on Kessler's face from a bullet grazing him that night. Knox owed Kessler his life, and Kessler had come to Christmas at Ruth's house every year since, sitting beside Knox, drinking, laughing, calling Ruth sister in that warm voice Knox never questioned, because he believed the man who saved his life could never harm his mother. Knox stopped in front of Kessler, looked down at him, pulled his mother's photograph from his coat, the same one from the flyers he had plastered across Chicago for 24 days, blurred by snow yet still showing Ruth's crooked smile, and tossed it at Kessler's feet. The photo landed face up on the concrete. Ruth smiled, staring back at him, and Knox said, "Do you recognize her? The woman you called sister? The one who cooked turkey for you every Christmas, poured you tea while you sat in her kitchen telling jokes. You locked your sister in a basement. Kessler. You fed her once a day. You told her son was dead." Kessler looked at the photo, then up at Knox, and on his battered face was something Knox found more disgusting than betrayal itself. Calm. No remorse. No fear. No plea. He just shrugged, like he was talking about a business deal gone bad, and said, "It was just business, Knox. You know the rules. You took my southern territory. I needed leverage. Your mother was the best leverage. Nothing personal." Nothing personal. Knox looked at him, at that shrug, at that calm, and remembered his mother describing the dark basement, the single daily meal, the voice behind the steel door she recognized as belonging to the man who called her sister, the night she clawed through the vent with torn hands and blood running down her arms, the 12-year-old girl named Bryn who carried her home when the world abandoned her. And he looked back at Kessler, the man he once owed his life to, the man his mother called brother, and said softly, like wind moving through a cemetery, "She's not a rule, Kessler. She's not leverage. She's not business. She's my mother." Knox turned to Decker and nodded once, then turned and walked away. He said nothing more, no sentence, no explanation. That nod was all Decker needed. 15 years together meant they never needed more. Knox walked out of the warehouse, and behind him, in the darkness, there was no gunshot, no scream, no sound of violence the way people imagine it, only the echo of Knox's footsteps on concrete, each step farther than the last, each step lighter than the last, fading, fading, until there was only silence, and that silence weighed heavier than any explosion. Knox returned to the estate at 3:11 in the morning, stepped out of the armored car in the dark, and he did not go inside. He couldn't go inside with these hands with other people's blood dried black beneath his nails and in every crease of his skin, hands that only hours earlier had held Penny's paper star, and he couldn't carry those hands into the house where his mother was sleeping, where a 4-year-old child was dreaming of stars and dinosaurs. Because even though Knox Ashford lived by violence, he never carried violence across his mother's threshold. That was the one rule he hadn't broken. He went around to the back garden, where a hose was fixed to the brick wall for watering plants, turned the valve. Cold water rushed out, cold enough to numb his fingers in the first seconds, but he didn't pull back. He pushed both hands under the stream and scrubbed hard until the dried blood flaked off his skin in dark red-brown pieces and washed down the drain. Scrubbed until his hands burned red from cold and friction, yet they still didn't feel clean, not because blood remained, but because some things water couldn't wash away. He shut off the hose, stood there for a moment with wet hands and a shirt where the blood had faded to pale pink stains, then went up to the second-floor balcony overlooking the Chicago River. He needed air, needed to see something wider than 4 walls, wider than warehouses and blood and Trent's scream still looping in his head like a jammed tape that wouldn't stop. But when he stepped onto the balcony, he saw she was already there. Bryn sat on the balcony floor with her back against the wall, knees drawn to her chest, arms wrapped around her shins, staring out at the river. She didn't look up at his footsteps, didn't startle, as if she had known he would come here eventually, or as if she was too used to people appearing in the dark without warning, for fear to have any edge left. Knox stopped 3 steps away, looked at her messy brown hair lifting in the river wind, at her narrow shoulders curled inside the same thin jacket she hadn't changed out of, at her bare feet on the cold stone, and he realized she couldn't sleep either, that she too was fleeing 4 walls, looking for something larger than her pain to convince herself the world wasn't only what she had just lived through. He sat down beside her without speaking, and they stayed that way for a long time, 2 strangers from different worlds watching the same river, listening to the same water, feeling the same cold wind on their faces, and the silence wasn't awkward or heavy. Strangely, it was light. Light in the way silence is only light when words aren't needed for understanding. Then Bryn spoke, softly, eyes still on the river, as if she were talking to the water rather than to Knox. She said she lost her mother too. Knox turned to look at her, and she continued without looking at him, because there are stories you can only tell when you don't meet anyone's eyes. She said her mother left by choice. No kidnapping, no basement, no snake tattoos, nothing like that. Just an October afternoon, when her mother packed a suitcase, put on a coat, walked out of St. Catherine's orphanage, and Bryn stood behind the iron door at 12 years old, watched her cross the yard, turn toward the gate, wave down a taxi, and get in. Her mother looked at her, straight into her eyes through the glass, and Bryn thought she would open the door, run back, hug her, say she was joking, say she wasn't leaving. But the taxi drove off, and Bryn stood there until dark because she believed her mother would come back, and she never did. Bryn inhaled shakily and said sometimes she thought that hurt more than being kidnapped, because Knox's mother had no choice. She was held. She wanted to come home and couldn't, but Bryn's mother had a choice. She looked at her 12-year-old daughter and chose to leave, chose that Bryn wasn't worth staying for. And Bryn lived with that choice every day, every morning waking up asking what she lacked, what she did wrong, what kind of child made her mother look at her and decide to go. Knox looked at Bryn, and for the first time since meeting her in the diner that night, he truly saw her. Not a waitress, not the woman who kept his mother, not someone he needed to repay, but an equal human being who had endured pain no less than his own, only shaped differently. Pain born not of violence and basements, but of the choice of someone meant to love her unconditionally. And that pain, Knox had to admit, might be crueler, because it offered no enemy to punish, no one to blame but oneself. Knox said quietly that she had kept his mother for 3 weeks, carried her home, fed her, let her sleep, let her daughter call her Nan, gave her a family, did all of that while never having had anyone hold her, never having been carried home when cold, never having had someone cook porridge for her. She gave what she had never received, and that was something he couldn't buy with money or command with power. Bryn turned to look at Knox for the first time, and in the dim city light reflecting off the river he saw her eyes wet but not crying, restrained, always restrained, because she had learned restraint at 12. A glass door opening behind them made them both turn. Ruth stood there in the white nightgown the staff had put her in, silver hair loose on her shoulders, eyes wide with a flash of panic that softened when she saw the 2 of them on the balcony. She had woken often at night since escaping the basement, her sleep torn apart by nightmares she never described, but everyone read on her face each morning. And tonight, she woke again, went searching in the dark, because she feared that if she closed her eyes, when she opened them, she would be back underground. Ruth stepped onto the balcony, looked at Bryn, looked at Knox, looked at them sitting together under the Chicago night sky, and her light brown eyes, clearer tonight than they had been in days, seemed to read everything they had said simply by looking at them. She looked at Bryn first, her voice both gentle and firm, the voice of a mother speaking what she knew might be the most important words she had, and might forget tomorrow, so she had to say them now. She told Bryn not to stay in this world, that it devoured people, slowly, day by day, until they looked in the mirror and didn't recognize themselves anymore, that it had devoured her son. Then she turned to Knox, and in his mother's eyes he saw no blame, only the old sorrow of someone who had watched her child become what she prayed each night he wouldn't. And she said if he truly wanted to repay Bryn, he had to let her go, not make her part of his world, not pull her into the dark, because she and the little girl deserved to live in the light. Knox looked at his mother, then at Bryn, and he said nothing, because his mother was right. She was always right, and he had known it before she spoke. He had only needed to hear her say it to find the courage to do it. The next morning, winter sunlight spilled through the mansion's vast glass wall, laying pale gold streaks across the marble floor. And Bryn woke on a bed larger than her kitchen with Penny curled beside her, the child's hand still clutching the hem of her mother's shirt in sleep. She lay there for a moment, staring at the ceiling, listening to soft footsteps in the hallway, the clink of cups somewhere below, the living sounds of a house too large for the few who truly belonged to it. Then she gently freed Penny's hand, tucked the blanket around her, and went out. Knox was waiting in the downstairs living room. He sat on a black leather sofa, elbows on his knees, hands clasped, and when Bryn came down the stairs he looked up, and she saw that he'd changed clothes, showered, shaved, yet beneath the neat exterior his eyes still carried the imprint of a sleepless night. The shadow of warehouses and Trent's screams and blood on the garden hose. He stood as she approached and didn't circle his words, because Knox Ashford didn't circle anything, and because what he was about to say had been with him since his mother spoke on the balcony the night before. He said he'd bought the building, the one on Halstead where she lived, the whole building. The diner on the ground floor and the apartment above were hers, the papers in her name. No rent, no payments. From now on it was her home. He paused, then added that Penny would attend Lincoln Park Academy. He'd spoken with the principal, tuition, uniforms, books, transportation, all covered, from preschool through 12th grade. Bryn stood at the foot of the stairs with one hand on the rail and looked at him with eyes he couldn't read, not because she was hiding anything, but because too many things lived there at once. Gratitude, pride, pain, dignity, and a strange sorrow she couldn't explain, because she knew accepting meant saying goodbye. She said no, softly but firmly, explaining she hadn't taken Ruth in for payment. She carried her home because it was 5 below, and Ruth wore a nightgown. She fed her because there was food in her fridge. She kept her because her daughter called her Nan, and she wasn't cruel enough to let police take her from a child who slept holding her every night. She hadn't done any of it to trade for a building or tuition. Knox looked at Bryn and remembered the balcony, her story about her mother leaving, the words "sometimes that hurts more," and he understood why she refused, because all her life every gift had come with a price, and she'd learned early that nothing was free, and owing anyone meant danger. So she'd rather be poor, work night shifts, live in a small peeling apartment, than owe anyone even dust. He told her he knew she hadn't done it for payment, and because she'd expected nothing, because she'd carried his mother home at midnight knowing she'd get nothing. He owed her everything. This wasn't payment, it was the least he could do for the person who kept his mother alive when he couldn't. Bryn stood silent for a long time, looked toward the stairs where Penny slept, the 4-year-old who knew nothing of basements and blood, who deserved good schools and a room of her own and a childhood without rent anxiety. Then she looked back at Knox and nodded, barely visible but enough, saying she accepted for Penny, not for herself. Knox nodded, understanding, respecting her more for it. An hour later, Bryn stood at the mansion's front door with Penny in her arms, her old bag on her shoulder, worn sneakers still on her feet. Decker's car waited outside the gate to take them back to Halstead, to the apartment now hers, to a life she'd have to relearn without Nan folding stars, without wordless lullabies, without cinnamon mornings. Ruth stood in the foyer leaning on Knox, and when Bryn turned for a last look, Ruth hurried forward, afraid she'd vanish the way she'd vanished from her son, and she embraced Bryn, thin arms tight, trembling, tears soaking Bryn's shoulder as she cried silently, holding Bryn like the daughter she'd had for 3 weeks, and now had to give back. Penny cried too, arms around Ruth's neck, begging Nan to come home with them, and Ruth kissed her forehead, cheeks, nose, then stepped back, and with shaking hands unclasped the old silver bracelet from her own wrist, dulled and scratched by time, the only thing she'd kept when she crawled through the basement vent and ran into winter. She placed it on Bryn's wrist, cold silver against skin, and said through a breaking voice that Bryn was the daughter she never gave birth to, and must never forget it. Bryn cried then, freely, because for the first time in 27 years, someone had looked at her and said, "You are mine, not by obligation, but by love," and the old bracelet weighed more than any building, proof she was worth staying for. Bryn kissed Ruth's forehead, hugged her once more, then turned with Penny in her arms and walked out without looking back, because if she did, she wouldn't be able to leave. 2 worlds had touched for 3 weeks, warmed each other, given what money couldn't buy, and now they separated gently but decisively, just as Ruth had said, because light and darkness can't share a home forever without someone being consumed. 3 months after that snowstorm night, Knox Ashford sat beside his mother's bed in the largest bedroom of the Riverside mansion in Chicago, holding her hand and waiting. He waited every morning for the moment Ruth opened her eyes and looked at him, because that moment decided whether his day would be heaven or hell. Some mornings she opened her eyes, saw him, and smiled that familiar crooked smile he had known since he was a child, sitting at the kitchen table watching her bake. And she said, "Teddy bear, you're up early," in that warm voice, as if nothing had happened, as if there had been no basement, no 24 days, nothing but a mother and her son in an ordinary morning. And on those mornings, Knox felt reborn, every cell in his body coming back to life, and he sat with her for hours, listening to old stories, hearing her talk about the rose garden, the house in Bridgeport, the day he fell off his bike at age 7, and he listened as if it were the first time, even though he had heard it 100 times. Because every time she remembered was a miracle he didn't dare take for granted. But there were other mornings when she opened her eyes, looked at him, and there was nothing in those pale brown eyes. No teddy bear, no crooked smile, no recognition, only the polite confusion of an elderly woman looking at a stranger sitting by her bed. And she asked in a thin, gentle voice with no malice at all but more cruel than anything Knox had ever heard, "Who are you?" 3 words. Those 3 words killed him every time she said them. Not quickly, not cleanly, but slowly, layer by layer, peeling him apart. Because every time she asked, "Who are you?" he had to sit down, take her hand, look into her eyes, and say, "I'm Teddy, Mom, your son." And every time he said it, a small part of him died. Something cracked and fell to the floor where no one could pick it up, because he had found his mother. She was here, in his home, safe, cared for. But his mother didn't always find him. She was here, and some days she wasn't. She looked at him, and some days she didn't see him. And that was a scar no one could heal. Not a scar on skin, but a scar in time, in memory, in the distance between a mother and a son, sitting right beside her whom she couldn't recognize. The doctors said the psychological trauma from the basement had accelerated a memory decline that had already begun, that she might improve, or she might not, that medicine had limits, and love couldn't cure disease. It could only make the sick less alone. Knox listened, nodded, paid, then went home and sat by his mother's bed and waited, because that was the only thing he could do. Wait and hope that tomorrow morning when she opened her eyes, she would call him Teddy Bear. Wednesday afternoon, Knox visited his mother at the old house in Bridgeport, the house he'd restored for her because she said she wanted to go home. Didn't want the mansion, didn't want marble floors and crystal chandeliers. She wanted a small gas stove and a window facing the garden and the smell of damp earth after rain she had breathed for 30 years. He stepped into the backyard, and the first thing he saw was the rose bush. The rose bush that 3 months earlier had withered, yellow leaves piled at its base because no one had watered it for nearly a month. The rose bush his mother had asked him to water in their last phone call that he had ended without doing it. That rose bush was now blooming red. Deep red roses opened in the spring afternoon sun, petals plump, fresh, alive, and Knox stood there, remembering the night he'd stood in this garden, staring at the dying bush, thinking he'd failed at the smallest thing his mother asked. And now the roses were alive because he watered them every day for 3 months without missing once, never forgetting again. He went inside, upstairs to his mother's room, and Ruth was sitting in an armchair by the window, folding napkins into stars, her hands still precise, still quick, because her hands remembered even when her mind didn't. She looked up at the sound of his footsteps, and he stopped in the doorway, heart racing, waiting for the deciding moment, waiting for her eyes to tell him whether today was heaven or hell. Ruth looked at him. Silence, long silence, long enough that Knox felt the floor tilt beneath his feet, long enough that he'd prepared for the 3 words, "Who are you?" Prepared to sit down and say, "I'm Teddy, Mom," one more time, prepared for another piece of himself to break. Then she smiled, the crooked smile, the smile he had known since before he could speak, the smile he saw every morning at the kitchen table when she toasted bread with cinnamon, the smile he'd searched for 24 days in the snow. That smile was here now, on her face, warm, real, alive. "Teddy Bear, you forgot to water my roses again, didn't you?" Knox wanted to say he had watered them, that he watered them every day, that the roses were blooming red outside, but his throat tightened and his eyes burned. So he just stepped forward, knelt beside her chair, took her hand, and nodded, because today she remembered. Today she called him Teddy Bear. Today was heaven. His phone vibrated lightly in his pocket. He took it out, looked at the screen, and saw a message from Bryn. No words, just a photo. Penny standing in front of the diner on Halstead, the diner newly renovated with a new sign and fresh paint, and the child holding a paper star in her hand, a nearly perfect 5-pointed star this time, because Nan had taught her long enough for it to stick. And beneath the photo, a single line, Nan. Penny folded a star. Knox looked at the picture, at Penny smiling, at the paper star in her hand, then looked back at his mother folding stars by the window. And he remembered Penny's words that night, in the small apartment on Halstead. Nan said whoever holds a star won't get lost. He stood, walked out into the garden, went down to the river behind the house. In his coat pocket, he still had one last flyer, the one he never posted, the flyer with his mother's face blurred by snow but her crooked smile still clear. He took it out, looked at it one last time, then tore it into pieces, piece by piece, and let them scatter over the Chicago River. White scraps floated in the spring wind, spinning on sunlit water, drifting away, carrying with them 24 days of despair, the basement and the darkness, and Trent's screams and blood on his hands, and everything Knox wanted to release into the river so it would never return. He stood there watching the water, thinking that some things can be found and still be lost. His mother was here, but some days she wouldn't remember him. Trent was gone and would never return. Bryn had gone back to her world, where there was light he didn't belong to. And he, Knox Ashford, the Chicago kingpin feared by the city, stood alone by the river, looking at the red roses blooming in his mother's garden, understanding that living with things that can be lost at any moment is harder than building any empire. The story of Knox, Ruth, and Bryn ends here. Yet perhaps it doesn't truly end in your heart, because behind this story are lessons we can all feel, that love isn't measured by money or power but by small acts, by carrying a strange old woman home at midnight, by a crooked paper star given by a 4-year-old to a stranger because she believes he deserves it. That family doesn't have to share blood. Sometimes family is simply the one who stays when the world walks away, and that each of us, kingpin or waitress, rich or poor, carries scars no one sees, nights spent hugging our knees, staring into the dark, wondering if we're strong enough to face tomorrow. If this story touched your heart, if you saw a part of yourself in Knox, in Bryn, or in Ruth, please give us a like and a share so this story can reach more people. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the moving stories we bring every day. We'd love to know how you felt after hearing this story, whether it connected to your real life, whether you've ever met a Nan in your life, or whether you've ever been a Bryn carrying someone home when no one else cared. Please share your feelings from the depths of your heart in the comments below. We read every comment and treasure every word you write. We wish all of you watching this video good health, a joyful life, peaceful days, and always someone who loves you by your side. Goodbye, and see you in the next video.